the red dust of Red Butte. Texas was a character in itself. It settled in the creases of Evelyn Moore's ledger at the general store, clung to the hem of her gray calico dress, and painted the evening sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. It was the taste of late summer in the 1870s, a fine grit on the tongue that promised another dry day. From her stool behind the counter, Evelyn could hear the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer, a steady heartbeat for the town. The air smelled of hot metal, cured leather from the saddle shop, and the sweet, dusty scent of hay from the livery. Life in Red Butte was measured by these sounds and smells, and by the slow, inexorable crawl of the new railroad line through the valley, a steel serpent promising progress and stirring up trouble. Evelyn dipped her pen in the inkwell, the scratching sound a small anchor in the day's slow current. She was good with numbers. They were clean, logical. They did not whisper behind their hands or cast judging glances. A column of figures, correctly added, was a small, perfect truth in a world that often felt messy and crooked. The bell above the door jingled, admitting a swirl of dust and Talia Monroe, whose presence was always a welcome gust of wind. Thalia's eyes, the color of cornflowers, sparkled with a humor that the Texas sun had not managed to bake out of her. Thalia leaned against the counter, fanning herself with her bonnet. She told Evelyn it was hot enough to melt a pistol. She then lowered her voice, a conspiratorial glint in her eye. She said that Margaret Finch was on the move, making her way down the street like a galleon under full sail, and she was headed directly for the store. Evelyn's hand tightened on her pen. Margaret Finch, owner of the boarding house, was the town's primary purveyor of news, speculation, and outright fabrication. Her tongue was sharper than a skinning knife and twice as busy. Evelyn felt the familiar clenching in her stomach, the heat rising to her cheeks. She focused on the ledger, pretending to check a sum. She hoped the woman would just buy her thread and leave. But Margaret Finch never did just one thing. She bustled in, her voice filling the small space, booming about the heat, the dust, and the price of flour. She set a small basket on the counter and fixed Evelyn with a look that was both pitying and predatory. Margaret said, "Oh, Evelyn, dear, you work so hard. It is not right for a young woman to be shut away with books all day." She said there was a gentleman, a respectable man new to the area, who was looking to make an acquaintance. He was a cattle buyer, she elaborated, a man of means, but shy. He had asked Margaret if she knew of any respectable, unmarried ladies. Evelyn felt Thalia stiffen beside her. This was Margaret's favorite game, dangling the prospect of a match in front of the town's spinsters and widows, treating their loneliness as a public spectacle. "And I thought of you," Margaret continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You, with your good sense and quiet ways." She proposed a meeting, tonight, at the Beartooth Saloon. She added that it was the only place a man could get a decent steak, so Evelyn should not think anything of the location. He would be waiting at the corner table at 7. The Beartooth Saloon, the words hung in the air, thick with the smell of stale beer and cheap perfume. It was a place for cowboys, railroad men, and women of a certain character. It was not a place for Evelyn Moore. The suggestion was a deliberate insult, a public dare. The whole town would know Margaret had sent her there. They would watch her walk in, watch her sit alone if the man never appeared, which he likely would not. It was a setup, a cruel joke designed to remind Evelyn of her place, the jilted woman, the woman whose own sister, Annabelle, had run off with her fiancé 2 years ago, leaving Evelyn's pride in tatters. Evelyn's throat was tight. She wanted to say no, to tell Margaret Finch to take her pity and her schemes and sell them to someone else. But then she saw the triumphant smirk playing at the corners of Margaret's lips. She saw the expectation of a refusal, her quiet retreat, and something inside her, a stubborn piece of iron she did not know she possessed, refused to bend. She looked up from her ledger, her gaze level, She told Margaret that sounded very thoughtful. She would be there. The silence that followed was more satisfying than any angry retort could have been. Margaret Finch's jaw went slack. Talia choked back a laugh and disguised it as a cough. Without another word, Evelyn stood up, retrieved the spool of black thread Margaret had come for, and placed it on the counter. She stated the price in a clear, steady voice, after Margaret had swept out, thoroughly deflated. Talia grabbed Evelyn's arm. She asked if Evelyn had lost her mind. She called Margaret a venomous old hen and said this was a trap. Evelyn knew, but she told Talia that she was tired of running. She was tired of hiding from their whispers and their pity. For one night, she would not let them make her feel small. She would walk in, hold her head high, and if no one was there, she would order a sarsaparilla, drink it slowly, and walk out. As dusk settled, the lights of the Beartooth Saloon glowed a hazy, golden yellow through the dust. The sound of a tinny piano and rough laughter spilled out onto the boardwalk, which was uneven and treacherous in the dim light. Evelyn had changed into her best dress, a simple blue muslin, and pinned her hair up with care. Each pin was a piece of armor. She walked down the main street, her heart hammering against her ribs. She felt every eye on her, from the men smoking on the hotel porch to the women peering through their curtains. The whispers seemed to follow her, a breeze made of words. There goes the Moore girl, the one Caleb Hart left for her sister, going to the saloon. Can you imagine, bless her heart? She pushed open the bat-wing doors. The noise hit her first, a wall of sound. The place was crowded, smelling of sweat, whiskey, and smoke. The piano player hammered out a tune, ignoring the sour notes. A hush fell as she stepped inside. Every head turned. In that moment, she understood the helpless feeling of a rabbit caught in the open. She saw Jeb Sloan, the freight boss, leaning against the bar. His eyes, small and hard, assessed her with a flicker of amusement. He ran half the business in this town, legal and otherwise, and his approval was a currency she did not possess. Her gaze swept the room, searching for the corner table. Her stomach dropped. Someone was there, a man. His back was to her, but he was broad-shouldered, wearing a clean shirt. This was not part of the plan. She had been prepared for an empty chair, for the humiliation of being stood up. She had not been prepared for someone to actually be there. And he was not alone. Sitting next to him, on a chair piled high with coats, was a little girl. She had 2 blonde braids and was concentrating fiercely on a piece of paper and a bit of charcoal. The man turned his head as if sensing her presence. The room seemed to tilt. It was Sheriff Silas Reeve. Silas Reeve was a legend in the county, a man who had faced down outlaws and settled disputes with a quiet word or, when necessary, a terrifyingly fast draw. He was a man of few words and unshakable fairness. His face was weathered by the sun and marked by a grief that had never quite left his eyes since his wife had died a few years back. He was raising his daughter, Lydia, on his own. He was the most respected, and perhaps the most feared, man in Red Butte, and he was the last person Evelyn expected to see. He stood up, his height seeming to diminish the noisy room. He was not smiling, but his eyes were calm. He pulled out the chair opposite him. He said her name, a simple statement, Miss Moore. Evelyn walked toward the table as if in a dream. The whispers started up again, but now they were laced with confusion. What was the sheriff doing with her? Lydia looked up from her drawing, her blue eyes wide and curious. Evelyn sat down, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She managed to say his title? Sheriff. She could not think of what else to say. The situation was so far beyond what she had imagined that her mind was a complete blank. Silas Reeve sat back down. He did not seem bothered by the attention they were drawing. He told her that Mrs. Finch had mentioned she might be joining him for supper. He had been meaning to speak with her anyway, about the new inventory system at the store. He said it was more efficient. It was a simple, plausible explanation. A lifeline. He was giving her a reason to be here. A shield against the town's speculation. She felt a wave of gratitude so strong it almost made her dizzy. She told him it was no trouble, and found herself explaining the way she cross-referenced the orders with the stock sheets. He listened intently, nodding in all the right places, making her feel as if the management of salt pork and calico was the most important subject in the world. A waitress came over, her eyes wide with curiosity. And they ordered. Silas asked for a steak for himself and chicken for Lydia. Evelyn, feeling bold, ordered the same as the sheriff. When the food came, Lydia held up her drawing for Evelyn to see. It was a picture of a woman with a wild scrawl of hair and a triangle for a dress. On her head was a lopsided, spiky circle. Lydia announced proudly that it was a princess. She was wearing a crown. Lydia then looked at Evelyn's carefully pinned hair, and then back at the drawing. She said, "Like you." Evelyn's heart ached with a sudden, sharp tenderness. She told the little girl it was the most beautiful drawing she had ever seen. Lydia beamed and, with great ceremony, pushed the paper across the table. It was a gift. From a nearby table, where a few ranch hands were drinking, a voice rose, slurred with liquor. "It seems the sheriff is tired of chasing bandits. Now he is rescuing spinsters." A coarse laugh followed. Evelyn froze, the fork halfway to her mouth. The old shame, hot and familiar, washed over her. This was it. This was the humiliation she had been steeling herself for. Sheriff Reeve did not turn around. He did not raise his voice. He simply stopped cutting Lydia's chicken, his hand resting on the knife. He looked at Evelyn, his gaze steady. He said, in a voice that was not loud but carried with absolute clarity, that some folks have so little in their own lives, they have to borrow noise from others. He then went back to cutting the chicken into small, perfect squares for his daughter. It was not a threat, but it was a wall. He had built it around their table with just a handful of quiet words. The ranch hands fell silent. Jeb Sloan, still at the bar, watched the exchange with a narrowed, unreadable expression before turning back to his drink. The moment passed. The rest of the meal was quiet, but it was a comfortable silence. Lydia, having decided Evelyn was a friend, chattered about her pony and a horned toad she had found. Evelyn found herself relaxing, laughing at the girl's stories. She saw a different side of the formidable Sheriff Reeve, a softness in his eyes as he watched his daughter, a gentle patience in the way he wiped a smudge of gravy from her cheek. When they were finished, Silas paid for the meal and helped Lydia with her coat. He walked with Evelyn out of the saloon and into the cool night air. The moon was high, casting long shadows down the empty street. He told her he was sorry about the words spoken in the saloon. Evelyn looked at him. The moonlight softened the hard lines of his face. She said that he had nothing to be sorry for. She thanked him. He just nodded. He said that a town this small can be hard on people, especially people who have their own mind. They walked in silence for a time, Lydia's small hand tucked into her father's. As they neared the boarding house where Evelyn rented a room, he stopped. He said that Margaret Finch had her own reasons for doing things. He advised Evelyn not to let those reasons become hers. It was the most he had said all night, and the words settled deep inside her. He was not offering pity. He was offering respect. Later, in the quiet of her small room, Evelyn smoothed out the wrinkled drawing Lydia had given her, a princess in a crooked crown. For the first time in 2 years, she felt something other than the sting of betrayal and the dull ache of loneliness. It was not happiness, not yet, but it felt like hope. A tiny, fragile seed planted in the relentless red dust. She knew the whispers would not stop. She knew the past was not a place you could simply walk away from. But as she looked at the child's drawing, she felt a flicker of her own strength return. She had walked into the lion's den and found not a beast, but a quiet, steady lawman and his little girl. And for now, That was more than enough. The tentative peace Evelyn had found was as fragile as a spring wildflower. The weeks following her supper with Sheriff Reeve had been quiet. The town's gossip, having been so decisively silenced by the sheriff, had retreated to a low murmur. It was still there, of course, a current beneath the surface, but it no longer had the power to knock her off her feet. She held the memory of his quiet defense like a smooth, warm stone in her pocket. The day of the spring fair arrived bright and clear, the sky a vast, aching blue. A breeze, for once not heavy with dust, carried the scent of baking pies and fresh sawdust. The main street was alive with people. Families from outlying ranches had come into town, their wagons rattling and their children scrubbed clean. Booths had been set up, selling everything from jams and preserves to hand-stitched quilts and sturdy leather goods. Evelyn was helping Thalia at her stall, where Thalia's famous apple pies were selling almost as fast as she could lay them out. Thalia, wiping a smudge of flour from her cheek, remarked that if gold were as plentiful as gossip, Margaret Finch would be the richest woman in Texas. Evelyn laughed, a genuine, easy sound that felt new in her own ears. She saw Sheriff Reeve across the square. He was not in uniform, but in simple, durable work clothes. He stood watching Lydia attempt to win a ribbon by tossing rings over wooden pegs. He looked relaxed, the lines of worry on his face smoothed away. When Lydia finally succeeded, her triumphant whoop echoed across the square. He swung her up into his arms, and the rare sight of his full, unguarded smile made something in Evelyn's chest feel warm and light. Lydia spotted Evelyn and wiggled to be put down, running toward her with a piece of paper clutched in her hand. She was wearing a yellow dress, the color of a buttercup, and she was a small sunbeam of pure joy. She showed Evelyn her new drawing. This one was more detailed than the last. There were 3 figures: a tall man with a star on his chest, a little girl with yellow braids, and a woman standing beside them. The woman also wore a yellow dress. Lydia pointed a small, jam-sticky finger at each figure. "Papa, me, the lady in yellow." She looked up at Evelyn, her blue eyes full of innocent hope. Evelyn felt a blush rise to her cheeks. She was wearing her plain blue muslin, but she had tied a small yellow ribbon, bought on a whim that morning, at her throat. It was a foolish, hopeful gesture, and now this child had seen it and put it in a drawing, creating a family where there was none. She knelt and told Lydia it was the finest picture in the whole town, and the little girl's answering hug was fierce and real. As she stood up, she saw Silas watching them, a thoughtful, unreadable expression on his face. He gave her a small, respectful nod before Lydia dragged him off toward a man selling lemonade. A little later, a woman Evelyn recognized as the widow of a ranch hand who had been killed the year before approached the sheriff. Evelyn was close enough to hear the woman's quiet words of thanks. She spoke of the Sparks Fund, a private charity Silas had established to help the families of men lost in the line of duty or to the harshness of the frontier. The woman said her boys had new boots for the winter because of him. Silas just said the community looks after its own, deflecting the praise as if it were a physical blow. Evelyn saw it then, the true measure of his influence. It was not just in the gun on his hip, but in the quiet, steady way he held the town together, mending the frayed edges of people's lives without fanfare or expectation of reward. The clang of the stagecoach bell cut through the festive noise. Its arrival was the main event of the afternoon, the town's link to the world beyond the red dust. A small crowd gathered as the coach, caked in dirt, rattled to a stop in front of the hotel. The driver threw down the mailbag. A few dusty passengers disembarked, and then the door opened one last time. A woman stepped out. She was dressed in a traveling suit of deep green silk, a color so rich and vibrant it made the dusty street look drab and faded. Her hair was a cascade of auburn curls beneath a fashionable little hat. She moved with a liquid grace, a confidence that said she belonged to a world of cities and comfort. It was Annabelle. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. It felt as if all the air had been punched out of her lungs. 2 years. 2 years without a word. A letter? Nothing. And now here she was, looking as if she had just stepped out of a magazine. And then a man stepped out behind her. He was handsome, well-dressed, with an easy smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He took Annabelle's arm with a familiar possessiveness. It was Caleb Hart. A collective gasp went through the crowd, a ripple of shocked delight. The story was a legend in Red Butte. And here were its main characters, returned to the stage. Evelyn could feel the eyes of the town turning toward her, eager to see her reaction. Talia moved to stand beside her, a silent, solid presence. The whispers started immediately. A rustle of dry leaves that grew into a wind. It is Annabelle Moore, and Caleb Hart with her. Can you believe the nerve, poor Evelyn? I wonder what this means. The Moore sisters. At it again. Evelyn stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The past she had been so carefully trying to bury had just been dug up and put on public display. All her fragile progress, all her newfound confidence, crumbled to dust. She was once again the jilted bride, the pitiable older sister, the subject of the town's cruel speculation. Annabelle saw her then. Her perfect smile widened. She disentangled her arm from Caleb's and glided toward Evelyn, her expression one of delighted surprise. Sister, I cannot believe it. What a wonderful coincidence to find you here. Her voice was like honey, smooth and sweet and suffocating. Evelyn could not find her own voice. She could only stare at the sister who had shattered her life and then vanished without a trace. Annabelle did not seem to notice her silence. She turned to Caleb, who had followed her, his face a mask of polite awkwardness. Caleb, look, it is Evelyn. Does she not look well? Caleb had the decency to look uncomfortable. He cleared his throat and mumbled her name, not quite meeting her eyes. The confrontation Evelyn had dreaded for 2 years was happening, right here, in front of everyone. And it was worse than she had ever imagined. Annabelle was in complete control, playing the part of the loving sister, while Evelyn was cast as the stunned, silent victim. Annabelle leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, though it was still loud enough for those nearby to hear. I know this must be a surprise. We came because of Caleb's new work. He is a land agent for the railroad now. He is working with Mr. Sloan. It is a very important position. The mention of Jeb Sloan sent a fresh chill down Evelyn's spine. The railroad, Caleb, and Jeb Sloan. It was a dangerous combination. Annabelle's eyes, the same shade of blue as their mother's, held a glint of triumph. She looked from Evelyn to Caleb, then back again. Her next words were delivered with a sweet, piercing precision, a surgeon's knife twisting in an old wound. You should be happy for us, Evelyn. After all this time, should you not be happy for your sister? It was a masterful stroke of cruelty, disguised as a plea for reconciliation. It painted Evelyn as bitter and unforgiving if she did not respond with grace. It demanded that she bless the union that had broken her heart. The crowd waited, holding its collective breath. This was the drama they had been craving. Evelyn finally found her voice. It came out quiet, but steady. She said that she wished Annabelle well. She hoped she would find what she was looking for. It was not the blessing Annabelle wanted, nor the outburst the crowd expected. It was a simple, dignified dismissal. She then turned to Thalia and said, quite clearly, that the pies must be getting cold. Without another glance at her sister or her former fiancé, she walked back to the booth, her back straight, every step an act of will. The rest of the day was a blur. The town was buzzing with the news. Annabelle and Caleb were the center of attention. They were beautiful, they were prosperous, they were connected to the railroad and the future. They represented everything Red Butte aspired to be. Beside them, Evelyn felt like a relic of the past, a drab sparrow next to two brightly colored parrots. That evening, as the fair was winding down and lanterns were being lit, Thalia brought news. She had overheard a conversation. Jeb Sloan had been seen in deep conversation with Annabelle and Caleb at the saloon. They were not just talking business. They were talking about land. Specifically, a plot of land on the edge of town. A plot with an old cottonwood tree and a small, weathered house. The house where Evelyn's mother still lived. Sloan wanted the land. The railroad needed it for a coal depot, a place to store fuel for the engines, and he was prepared to pay for it. The threat was no longer just a matter of pride or public humiliation. It was a length of steel track, aimed directly at the heart of what little Evelyn had left. Her family's home, the whispers, the pointed stares, the return of a painful past. All of it paled in comparison to this. This was a fight for survival, and she had a sinking feeling that her sister had just chosen the winning side. The railroad dust changed the texture of the air in Red Butte. It was finer than the familiar red soil, a gritty gray powder that coated windowsills and soured the water in the horse troughs. It was the dust of progress, and it carried tension on the wind, disputes over property lines. Once the subject of lazy afternoon arguments, now became heated contests. Old deeds were unearthed, their boundaries described by long-gone trees and streams that had changed their course. The railroad, with Jeb Sloan as its local agent, was hungry for land, and its hunger was making neighbors into enemies. This new, sharp-edged reality arrived at Evelyn's mother's doorstep in the form of Annabelle. She did not come alone, but with Caleb Hart at her side. His presence a constant, painful reminder of a past Evelyn was trying to escape. They came bearing a basket of goods from the general store and a proposition coated in sweet poison. They sat in the small, tidy parlor of the house Evelyn had grown up in. Her mother, Martha, a woman whose spirit had been worn down by years of hardship, looked from one daughter to the other, her face a mask of confusion and hope. Annabelle did the talking. Her voice was a soft, persuasive melody. She spoke of the future, a word she polished until it shone. She told her mother that the railroad was a gift, an opportunity to sell this old, drafty house for more money than their father had ever seen in his life. She painted a picture of a comfortable life in a new town, perhaps even San Antonio, with a proper house with glass windows and no dust. She said they were doing this for her security. It is for the best. Mother, you deserve a rest. Evelyn listened, her hands clenched in her lap. She heard the calculation beneath the sweet words. She saw the way Caleb watched her mother, his eyes assessing the value of the property, not the woman who lived in it. Evelyn spoke up, her voice tight. She asked Annabelle where their mother was supposed to go. She reminded her that this was their home, built by their father's own hands. Every scuffed floorboard, every patched wall held a memory. She argued that selling to Jeb Sloan was not progress, it was surrender. Annabelle sighed. A theatrical display of patience tried. Sister, you are so sentimental. This is not about the past. It is about the future. You cannot live in a memory. She turned back to their mother, her expression softening. Do not worry. Mother, Caleb and I will handle everything. You just need to sign the papers. The conflict hung in the small room, thick and suffocating. Martha Moore, caught between the determined ambition of one daughter and the fierce loyalty of the other, looked lost. For now. She did not sign, but the seed of doubt had been planted. The town, of course, chose a side. Margaret Finch made sure of that. Her version of the story, spread with the efficiency of a prairie fire, was that the stubborn elder, Miss Moore, was standing in the way of progress. And worse, she was using the sheriff to do it. Margaret would stand on the boardwalk and tell anyone who would listen. Did you see her walking with Sheriff Reeve in the evenings? And that little girl of his is always hanging on her skirts. She is a clever one. That Evelyn, She knows a man with a badge can be very useful when you have something to protect. The whispers followed Evelyn again, but this time they were different. They no longer painted her as a pitiable victim, but as a conniving manipulator. It was a new kind of shame, one that felt dirtier, because it twisted something good and clean into something ugly. The only antidote to the poison was Lydia. The child was immune to the town's malice. One afternoon, as Evelyn was leaving the store, she found Lydia waiting for her on the steps of the sheriff's office across the street. The little girl held up her braids, which were coming undone. She demanded, with the absolute authority of a 6-year-old, that Evelyn fix them. Evelyn hesitated. Glancing around the street, she could feel the eyes watching from the windows of the hotel. To sit on the steps of the jailhouse and braid the sheriff's daughter's hair felt like a public declaration of something she was not yet ready to name. But Lydia's expectant face, smudged with dirt and full of trust, was impossible to refuse. She sat on the wooden steps, the late afternoon sun warm on her back, and carefully unraveled the messy braids. Her fingers, nimble from years of sewing and bookkeeping, worked deftly, weaving the strands of fine, blonde hair into 2 neat plaits. Lydia chattered on about a caterpillar she had named Bartholomew. The door to the office opened. Sheriff Reeves stood there, holding a stack of papers. He did not say anything. He just watched them, leaning against the doorframe. The harshness of his face was gone, replaced by an expression of profound, quiet contentment. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips as he watched Evelyn tie the ends of the braids with bits of scrap ribbon from her pocket. The moment was a small island of peace in a sea of trouble. It was this quiet connection that frightened Evelyn the most. It felt real, and real things could be taken away. She was terrified of the pain a second loss would bring, terrified that this fragile happiness was just another thing for her sister to covet, and perhaps to take. The land itself seemed to reflect the town's mood. A dry wind blew in from the west, day after day, sucking the moisture from the earth. The creek that ran behind the town shrank to a muddy trickle. The grass in the pastures turned brittle and brown. Ranchers had to drive their herds farther and farther to find grazing, and their lean, thirsty cattle were a constant reminder of the thin line between survival and ruin. The heat frayed everyone's nerves. Tempers were short. Fights broke out in the saloon over trivial things. The whole community felt like a tightly wound spring. Silas Reeve felt it too. He moved through the tension with his usual calm, but his eyes missed nothing. He had started his own quiet investigation into Jeb Sloan's land acquisitions. He spent his evenings poring over county records, tracing the ownership of every parcel the railroad had purchased. He found a pattern of suspiciously low prices, of deeds signed by men who were known to be deep in debt to Sloan's freight company. He also heard whispers from his deputy about Sloan's men paying visits to reluctant landowners, their conversations friendly on the surface, but with a hard edge of intimidation underneath. One afternoon, he walked into the freight office. Jeb Sloan was behind his large oak desk, a cigar clamped in his teeth. He smiled when he saw the sheriff, a wide, confident smile that did not reach his cold eyes. Silas did not waste time with pleasantries. He said he had been hearing concerns. Some folks felt pressured to sell their land. Sloan blew a smoke ring. He said that was just business. Progress is always a little uncomfortable for those who get in its way. Silas's voice remained low and even. He said that this was his town. He expected business to be conducted fairly. He would not tolerate intimidation or threats. He let the words hang in the air, a clear, unmistakable warning. He was drawing a line in the dust. Then he turned and walked out, leaving Sloan staring after him, his confident smile gone. A bit of humor was a rare commodity, but Thalia Monroe still had some to spare. One sweltering afternoon, a pair of young, swaggering cowboys stood at her pie stall, complaining about the price. One of them said that for that much, the pie ought to come with a deed to the whole town. Thalia, without missing a beat, told him that if he wanted a deed to the town, he should talk to Jeb Sloan. But if he wanted a piece of heaven, he would pay her price and be grateful for it. She added that her prices were fixed, unlike the news from Margaret Finch, which always came with a hidden tax on your reputation. The cowboys laughed, paid for their pie, and tipped their hats. Evelyn, who had been delivering a sack of flour, felt a small lift in her spirits. But the relief was short-lived. That night, a new light flickered in the sky, a hungry, angry orange that did not belong to the moon or the stars. The fire bell began to clang, a frantic, desperate sound that pulled everyone from their beds. The main warehouse down by the tracks was burning. The whole town turned out to fight it. A bucket brigade of men and women working in a desperate, chaotic rhythm. The heat was immense, and the air was thick with smoke and the sharp, acrid smell of burning pine and tar. Evelyn worked alongside Thalia, her face smudged with soot, her arms aching from the weight of the water buckets. They managed to save the adjacent buildings, but the warehouse was a total loss. By dawn, it was a smoking, blackened skeleton against the pale sky. People stood in weary, silent groups, their faces grim. The talk was of a stray spark from the evening train, or perhaps lightning from a dry storm. The old-timers muttered about fire snakes, malevolent spirits of the prairie. Sheriff Reeve walked through the smoldering ruins, his face set like granite. He ignored the talk of accidents and superstitions. He knelt, examining the ground at the upwind corner of the foundation, the place where the fire seemed to have started. The wind that night had been blowing steadily from the south, but the deepest charring, the heart of the blaze, was on the north side. Sheltered from the wind, an accidental spark would have been blown against the south wall. This fire had been given help. It had been deliberately set, a torch thrown into the driest corner to ensure it would grow, fast and hot. It was not an accident. It was a message. And as he stood up and surveyed the destruction, Silas Reeve knew exactly who had sent it. The warehouse fire left a black scar on the edge of town and an invisible layer of fear on everything else. Jeb Sloan used that fear like a tool. The price he offered for the Moore property was now lower. The offer delivered by Caleb Hart with an air of regret that was as false as a lead dollar. He spoke of market uncertainty and the risks of rebuilding. It was a thinly veiled threat. Annabelle was more direct. She found Evelyn sweeping the porch of their mother's house, fighting a losing battle against the endless dust. She did not bother with pleasantries. Annabelle stated that she had told their mother it was time. She said this was the last offer they would get. She gestured at the house, a dismissive flick of her wrist. You cannot keep clinging to this old wreck. Evelyn, it is holding us back. There is no future here. Evelyn stopped sweeping. She looked at the peeling paint on the porch railing, at the faint groove worn into the floorboards where her father used to sit and clean his tools. It was not a wreck to her. It was the only anchor she had left in the world. She told Annabelle that some things were more important than money. Annabelle laughed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. You can say that because you have never had to worry about it. You have always been content with your little ledgers and your quiet corner. I want more than that, and I will not let this house, or you, stand in my way. The confrontation was cut short by a sudden change in the light. The brilliant, harsh blue of the sky was fading, replaced by a sickly, yellowish haze. The wind, which had been a constant, hot breath for weeks, fell away into an unnerving stillness. An unnatural silence descended upon Red Butte. The birds stopped singing. The blacksmith's hammer was quiet. Evelyn had seen this before. She grabbed Annabelle's arm. We have to get inside now. The first gust of wind hit them like a physical blow, slamming the front door shut and rattling the windows in their frames. It was followed by a low, menacing roar that grew steadily louder. Through the window, Evelyn saw the world dissolve. The horizon vanished, consumed by a solid wall of roiling, yellow-brown dust that was hurtling toward them. The sandstorm struck the town with the force of a tidal wave. The light outside went from yellow to a deep, claustrophobic orange, then to a murky darkness. as if the sun had been extinguished. The wind shrieked, a high, continuous scream. Sand, as fine as flour and as sharp as ground glass, forced its way through every crack and crevice in the old house. It hissed against the window panes and poured in under the door in a fine, shifting drift. Evelyn's first thought was of Lydia. She pictured the little girl playing in the yard behind the sheriff's office, or perhaps walking home from a friend's house. The thought of her caught out in this was a knife in Evelyn's gut. Without a second thought, she grabbed a thick shawl from a peg by the door, wrapped it around her head and mouth, and pulled the door open against the force of the wind. Annabelle cried out her name, telling her she was insane, but Evelyn was already outside. The force of the storm was staggering. She could barely stand. The air was a blinding, choking whirlwind of sand. She could not see more than a few feet in front of her. Debris, torn loose by the wind, flew past her in the gloom. She lowered her head and pushed forward, aiming for the center of the street, her only guide the feel of the rutted dirt beneath her feet. She fought her way toward the sheriff's office, her lungs burning, her eyes streaming. The building was a vague, dark shape in the maelstrom. She saw a flicker of movement near the side of the building and stumbled toward it. It was Lydia. The child was huddled against the wall, her small body shaking, her face buried in the side of the jailhouse stable, where Silas kept his horse. Evelyn half carried, half dragged the terrified child into the relative shelter of the stable. The air inside was still thick with dust, but they were out of the worst of the wind. The horse, a big roan named General, stamped nervously in his stall. Evelyn spoke to him in a low, soothing voice as she settled Lydia into a pile of clean hay in a corner. She took a handkerchief from her pocket, dipped it in the water bucket, and gently wiped the grit from Lydia's face. The little girl clung to her, her small sobs muffled against Evelyn's dress. They huddled together as the storm raged outside, the stable groaning under the assault. The world was reduced to the sound of the wind, the smell of hay and horse, and the comforting weight of the small child in her arms. It felt like an eternity later when the stable door was wrenched open. A figure stood silhouetted against the swirling gloom, a bandana tied over the lower half of his face. It was Silas. He tore the cloth from his face, his eyes wild with fear until they landed on them. The relief that washed over his features was so profound it seemed to physically alter him. He crossed the stable in 2 strides and knelt beside them, pulling Lydia into his arms and holding her so tight she grunted in protest. He held her for a long moment, his face buried in her hair. When he finally looked at Evelyn, his eyes were raw with an emotion she could not name. He did not need to say anything. She saw it all in his gaze, the terror of a father who had thought he had lost the only thing that mattered to him, and the overwhelming gratitude to the person who had kept his child safe. They waited out the rest of the storm in the quiet dark of the stable. When the wind finally began to lose its fury, Silas led them out into a transformed world. Red Butte was buried. The street was a landscape of deep, sandy drifts. Everything was coated in a thick, uniform layer of yellow dust. The air tasted of grit. He walked with her to her mother's house. The silence between them was not awkward, but full of unspoken things. At her porch, he stopped. He looked out at the scoured landscape, then back at her. He spoke in a low, rough voice. There are things a man never gets over, things that leave a mark. He paused, his gaze intense. But I know what I want to protect. I know what is worth fighting for. He did not say her name. He did not have to. He was talking about more than just his daughter. He was talking about a future she had not dared to imagine for herself. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture of profound respect, and then turned and walked away into the dusty twilight. Evelyn's heart was a chaotic drum in her chest. His words had shaken her to her core, leaving her feeling both terrified and astonishingly hopeful. The next day, she did something she had never done before. She cooked. She made a thick, savory beef stew, wrapped the pot in a towel to keep it warm, and walked across the street to the sheriff's office. She found him at his desk, surrounded by paperwork. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by the storm and its aftermath. He looked up in surprise as she entered. She felt a blush creep up her neck, but she did not back down. She told him she thought he and Lydia might appreciate a hot meal. She set the pot on the edge of his desk. A rare, small smile touched his lips. He thanked her, his voice full of a warmth that had nothing to do with the stew. Just then, Lydia emerged from a back room, her face lighting up when she saw Evelyn. She ran and hugged Evelyn's legs. Then she looked from Evelyn to her father, a thoughtful expression on her face. She whispered a question, her voice full of a child's simple, profound logic. "Are you Mama too?" The innocent words struck Evelyn with the force of a physical blow. They were a sweet, terrifying arrow that pierced through all her defenses. She felt a surge of warmth, a deep, aching love for this little girl, followed immediately by a cold wave of fear. To be a mother was a role she had never expected to play, a responsibility she did not know if she was strong enough to bear. She knelt and hugged the child, unable to speak, the smell of dust and hay still clinging to her clothes. Later that week, it seemed as if a different kind of storm might pass. Evelyn found Annabelle sitting alone by the nearly dry creek bed, her fashionable dress looking out of place against the stark landscape. For the first time since she had returned, her sister looked vulnerable. Her eyes were red-rimmed. She began to cry, quiet, wrenching sobs. She confessed her fear, her voice choked. She told Evelyn she was terrified of being poor, of ending up like their mother, worn out and alone. She said Caleb, with his connection to the railroad and his talk of money, had seemed like a lifeline. She admitted she had been jealous of Evelyn, not of Caleb, but of Evelyn's quiet strength, her ability to endure. "I just wanted something for myself," she whispered. "I was so afraid." Evelyn's anger melted away, replaced by a weary pity for this sister she barely knew anymore. She sat beside her and put an arm around her shaking shoulders. It was a fragile, momentary truce. But it was only momentary. 2 days later, Evelyn saw her. Annabelle was at the stagecoach stop, speaking quietly to the driver. As he loaded the mailbag, Annabelle slipped a thick envelope into his hand, along with a coin. It was a private transaction. The envelope was addressed to Jeb Sloane's office in the next county. Evelyn's blood ran cold. Annabelle's tears had been real. Her fear was likely genuine, but her ambition was stronger. She had sent the signed papers. The betrayal was complete. As if the world meant to pile on one last cruelty, their mother fell ill. The dust from the storm had settled in her lungs, and she developed a fever and a deep, rattling cough. Dr. Adams came and shook his head grimly. He needed laudanum to ease her breathing and quinine for the fever, but his supplies were low. The town's entire reserve of patent medicines and medical supplies had been in the warehouse that had burned. The news spread quickly. It was not just Martha Moore who was sick. Several of the older townspeople and a few children were suffering from the same lung ailment. There was not enough medicine to go around. Panic began to set in. That evening, Sheriff Reeve did something no one had expected. He unlocked the storeroom behind his office, the one where the Sparks Fund kept its emergency supplies. It was meant for widows and orphans, a private charity, but he declared that the town was in a state of emergency. He and Dr. Adams began distributing the medicine, free of charge, to anyone who needed it. It was an act of decisive compassion, a man cutting through rules to save lives. He was hailed as a hero by the grateful families. But as Evelyn watched him, a knot of dread formed in her stomach. Jeb Sloane was standing across the street, watching the proceedings with a cold, satisfied smile. This act of kindness was a weapon, and Evelyn knew Sloane would not hesitate to use it against him. He had just given his enemy the perfect opportunity to accuse him of overstepping his authority, of misusing funds, of breaking the very laws he was sworn to uphold. The town hall in Red Butte was not a grand affair. It was a long, barn-like structure made of raw pine, and for the occasion of the first meeting of the ladies who mend the West, it had been transformed. Colorful quilts, each a testament to countless hours of patient needlework, were hung on the walls, softening the rough wood and filling the room with a faint, clean scent of stored linen. A long table at the back was laden with cakes, pies, and jugs of fresh buttermilk, a testament to the community's pride and generosity. The air buzzed with conversation, the rustle of starched cotton dresses, and the sound of women's voices. A force as formidable as any Texas wind. Evelyn sat on a bench near the middle of the room, with Talia beside her. She had come to listen, to feel a part of something larger than her own troubles. The event was a celebration of the quiet, unyielding strength of frontier women. The speakers were women who had carved lives out of this harsh land through sheer force of will. There was a widow who ran her late husband's ranch with more success than he had ever managed. A young teacher who had faced down a blizzard to bring supplies to a sick family. And the stern, respectable wife of the circuit judge, who spoke on the importance of moral fortitude. Evelyn listened, drawing a fragile sense of comfort from their stories. Her mother was recovering, the fever broken by the medicine Silas had provided, but she was still weak. The weight of that worry, combined with the constant pressure from Annabelle and the looming threat of Jeb Sloan, had left Evelyn feeling worn thin. Annabelle was there, of course, seated near the front with Caleb Hart. She was the picture of fashionable concern, nodding gravely at the stories of hardship, her silk dress a jewel of color in the sea of homespun fabrics. She and Evelyn had not spoken since the day by the creek. A chasm had opened between them, one that felt too wide to ever be crossed. Sheriff Silas Reeve arrived a little while after the proceedings had begun. He entered quietly through the back door, holding Lydia by the hand, and stood near the wall, his hat in his hands. He was a solid, reassuring presence, a man who seemed to carry his own stillness with him. The organizers, seeing him, conferred for a moment before the judge's wife approached him. A quiet conversation followed. And then it was announced that the sheriff would say a few words about his Sparks Fund. He walked to the front of the room, Lydia clinging to his leg. He did not stand on the small raised platform, but on the floor, on the same level as everyone else. He spoke in his usual quiet, direct way. He said the fund was not his, but the town's. It was a promise that no one would be left to face hardship alone. He spoke of community as a rope made of many strands, each one weak on its own but strong when woven together. It was a short speech, without flourish or sentimentality, but it resonated with a deep, simple truth that filled the room. When he finished, the applause was heartfelt and sustained. He retreated to his spot by the wall, but before the next speaker could be introduced, another voice cut through the air. It was Margaret Finch. She stood up, her face flushed with a sense of self-importance. She held up a piece of paper. She announced that she felt it was her civic duty to share a matter of public concern. She said she had received an anonymous letter. A hush fell over the hall. Nothing good ever started with an anonymous letter. Margaret cleared her throat dramatically and began to read. The letter was written in a florid, looping hand, its words dripping with false piety and venom. It said, "It has come to the attention of a concerned citizen that the office of our sheriff is being compromised. A certain unmarried woman, using her pitiable situation to her advantage, has been seen to unduly influence our respected Sheriff Reeve. This woman, Evelyn Moore, has used the sheriff's own child as a pawn in her scheme, feigning affection to gain the father's sympathy and protection." A collective gasp swept through the room. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face. It felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. Talia reached over and gripped her hand, her knuckles white. Margaret's voice rose, filled with righteous indignation as she continued to read. "She has done this to protect her family's property from the path of progress. manipulating the law to serve her own selfish ends. We have seen our sheriff, a man once known for his impartiality, use a charitable fund meant for the truly deserving to provide medicine for this woman's family, while other, more pressing needs may have gone unmet. We must ask ourselves, is our lawman acting in the interest of justice, or is he acting under the spell of a designing woman? The letter ended, but the words hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Every eye in the room was on Evelyn. She felt stripped bare, every private moment, every kind gesture, twisted into something ugly and conniving. Her supper with Silas, her braiding of Lydia's hair, her gift of a simple stew, all of it was now evidence in a trial for which she had no defense. Her gaze flew to her sister. Annabel was staring at the floor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was pale, her expression unreadable. She did not look at Evelyn. She did not speak. She did not move. In her silence, Evelyn felt the final, definitive turning of a knife. This was a new, more profound abandonment. Annabel stood by and let the town devour her. The whispers began, a low, sibilant hiss that spread through the hall. Evelyn could not make out the words, but she felt their sting. She was drowning in their judgment. Then another voice, calm and cold as river stone, cut through the noise. It was Silas. He had stepped away from the wall. He did not look angry. He looked something far more dangerous, utterly certain. He let his gaze sweep across the room, and the whispering died under its weight. He looked directly at Margaret Finch. His voice was not loud, but every person in the hall heard every word. "I know who wrote that letter," he said simply. "The signature is a clumsy forgery, and the person who paid for it is not nearly as clever as he thinks he is." He did not elaborate. He did not have to. The statement was a piece of solid granite dropped into a pool of rumor. It implied a source of knowledge that no one else in the room possessed. It hinted at a network of information, at a sheriff who saw and heard far more than anyone suspected. He had not defended Evelyn's honor. He had simply dismantled the lie with a quiet, irrefutable authority that left no room for argument. He had turned the weapon back on the unseen enemy who had forged it. While the town was still processing the sheriff's stark pronouncement, Thalia, who had been scanning the floor, bent down. She picked up a small, folded piece of paper that had been lying near the bench where Margaret had been sitting. She unfolded it in her lap, her eyes narrowing. She nudged Evelyn and showed it to her. It was a receipt from the general store, from that very morning, for 1 bottle of Higgins's black ink. The name written on the store's account line was a man named Thomas Miller, a hired hand known to do Jeb Sloane's dirty work. The proof was there, cold and clear. This was not the work of a gossiping woman. This was an attack, planned and executed by Jeb Sloane. But the knowledge brought Evelyn no relief. She looked at Silas, standing tall and alone at the front of the room, and a wave of despair washed over her. She had done this to him. Her presence in his life had made him a target. Her problems had become his scandal. They were using her to try to ruin him, to undermine his authority, to strip him of the respect that was his greatest shield. She could not bear it. The weight of her own troubles was one thing. The thought that she was destroying this good, honorable man was another. She felt like a disease, a blight that spoiled everything she touched. The only way to save him, the only decent thing to do, was to cut herself out of his life completely. She had to leave, not just the town hall, but Red Butte. She would go somewhere no one knew her name, somewhere the past could not reach her. It was the only way to protect him. She stood up, her movements stiff and wooden. The murmuring in the room had started again, but it was confused now, uncertain. She did not look at anyone. She focused on the door at the back of the hall as if it were a distant shore and she was a drowning swimmer. She began to walk, her head held high out of a last, desperate instinct of pride. She could feel the stairs on her back. She heard Thalia whisper her name, a question and a plea, but she could not stop. Just as she reached the heavy wooden door, her hand outstretched to push it open, she risked one last look back. Her eyes met Silas's. He had not moved. He was watching her, and in his gaze she saw a sudden, stark understanding. He saw her despair. He saw her flight. He saw in her eyes that his public defense of the truth was not enough to heal the wound that had just been inflicted. He saw that he was losing her, and in that silent, frozen moment, as the whispers swirled around them, Evelyn saw a decision form in his eyes, a hard, resolute choice to do something he had never done before. The world narrowed to the heavy grain of the wooden door in front of Evelyn, and the deafening rush of blood in her own ears. Each beat of her heart was a hammer blow, urging her to flee, to run from the whispers, from the pity, from the crushing weight of being a burden to the one man who had shown her kindness. Her hand, trembling, was inches from the wood. Freedom was a single push away, a push into an empty, lonely future, but one where she would no longer be the cause of another's ruin. A shift in the room, a change in the quality of the silence, made her pause. The low hum of gossip did not just quiet, it was extinguished, snuffed out as if a heavy blanket had been thrown over a flame. She did not need to look to know that Silas had moved. She felt it, a change in the room's center of gravity. He was walking. She forced herself to turn, her body stiff with dread. He was coming toward her. He moved with that same unhurried, deliberate pace he used when walking toward trouble, his boots making a slow, steady rhythm on the pine floorboards. He was not looking at the crowd. He was not looking at Margaret Finch or the judge's wife. His gaze was fixed on her, and it was a look of such raw, unwavering intensity that she felt pinned in place, unable to move, unable to breathe. The entire town hall, with its quilts and cakes and simmering resentments, seemed to fade away, leaving only the long, 50-foot stretch of floor between them. With every step he took, she saw the faces he passed reflected in her peripheral vision. Talia's mouth was agape, her eyes wide with a wild, disbelieving hope. Margaret Finch's face was a mottled mask of fury and confusion. Annabel, her sister, had finally looked up, and her expression was one of dawning horror, as if she were watching a play she had written take a terrible, unforeseen turn. He stopped directly in front of Evelyn, so close she could see the fine lines the sun had etched around his eyes and the faint dusting of red dirt that seemed permanently embedded in the creases of his neck. He smelled of clean cotton, leather, and the vast, dry air of the plains. He said nothing. He simply held her gaze, and in the deep, steady brown of his eyes, she saw no pity. She saw a decision. A hard and final choice had been made. Then, in an act so unexpected, so completely out of character that a collective gasp rippled through the hall, the most famous, quietest sheriff in Red Butte slowly went down on one knee. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence deeper than the prairie at midnight, a silence so profound that Evelyn could hear the frantic, frightened beat of her own heart. He knelt there on the dusty floor, the silver star on his chest catching the lamplight, his head bowed for a moment as if in prayer. When he looked up at her again, his eyes were full of a fierce, protective tenderness that shattered what was left of her resolve. From the pocket of his simple canvas trousers, he pulled a small, plain object. It was a ring, a simple, unadorned band of yellow gold, worn smooth with time. It was not new. It held a history. He held it out on the palm of his calloused hand. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and rough, hoarse with the dust of the trail and thick with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. The words were not for the crowd. They were for her alone. But in the stillness, they carried to every corner of the room. Her sister stole her fiancé. He let the ugly, whispered truth of the town's gossip hang in the air, acknowledging it, owning it, and then robbing it of its power to harm her. People laughed at her. He spoke the second truth, the one that had been the source of her deepest shame. He did not deny it. He faced it head on. "But she," he continued, his voice growing stronger, his eyes never leaving hers, "she is the one who gave my daughter a sense of dignity. She gave me a reason to believe in the sunrise again." The simple, profound words were a balm on every wound she had ever suffered. He was not defending her. He was defining her. He was telling the town, and telling her what he saw when he looked at her. He saw not a victim, but a savior. He saw not a spinster, but a sunrise. A small figure broke from the spellbound crowd. Lydia, who had been watching with wide, uncomprehending eyes, ran across the floor. She did not seem to notice the stunned faces or the charged atmosphere. She ran to her father's side, her small hand coming to rest on his kneeling shoulder. She looked from the ring in his hand to Evelyn's tear-streaked face. Her childish voice, high and clear, pierced the silence with a question of heartbreaking simplicity. "Does this mean I have a mama?" The question shattered the last of Evelyn's defenses. The wall she had so carefully built around her heart, the wall of pride and fear and self-preservation, crumbled into dust. This was not just about her and Silas. This was about this little girl, this bright, innocent soul who was asking for a family. This was about a home. Tears she had held back for 2 years. Tears of humiliation, of loneliness, of quiet despair, finally fell. But they were followed by new tears. Tears of a hope so fierce and bright, it was painful. She looked down at the quiet, kneeling lawman and the small, expectant child, and she saw a future she had never allowed herself to dream of, a future that was terrifying in its potential for happiness, and even more terrifying in its potential for loss. But it was a future being offered with an open hand and love in his eyes. To run now would not be an act of self-preservation. It would be an act of cowardice. She could not speak. The word was trapped in her throat. So she nodded, a small, jerky movement at first, then a deeper, more certain one. "Yes." Silas's face, which had been tense with a terrible vulnerability, softened with a relief so profound it seemed to take the weight of years off his shoulders. He took her trembling left hand in his. His fingers were rough and warm. He gently slid the simple gold band onto her finger. It fit perfectly. A single, loud clap broke the silence. It was Thalia. She was on her feet, her face shining with tears and a triumphant grin. Her clap was followed by another, then another, as the judge's wife rose, and then the rancher's widow. And soon the entire hall, save for a few sour-faced exceptions, was on its feet. The sound of their applause was a wave, a cleansing tide that washed away the poison of the whispers and the anonymous letter. It was an affirmation not just of a proposal, but of a truth they had all just witnessed. In the midst of the applause, Evelyn saw Jeb Sloan slip out the back door, his face a thunderous mask of rage. His public humiliation of the sheriff had not only failed, it had forged his enemies into a family, celebrated by the very town he sought to control. Caleb Hart stood awkwardly beside a frozen Annabelle, his face pale, looking like a man who had just realized he had placed his bet on the wrong horse. And Annabelle just stood there, her hands clenched at her sides, her face a mixture of shock, envy, and a new, terrible isolation. In a single, public moment, her sister had been given everything Annabelle had schemed to get for herself: security, respect, a place in the community. But it had not been won with manipulation or beauty. It had been earned with quiet kindness, and it had been sealed with a love that was as plain and as strong as a band of gold. She was no longer a part of the story. She was just a spectator. Silas rose to his feet. Pulling Evelyn gently toward him, Lydia threw her arms around Evelyn's legs, her face buried in the folds of her dress. Evelyn rested her free hand on the child's head, her new ring cool and solid on her finger. She looked at Silas, her quiet sheriff, and saw not just a lawman, but her lawman. her sunrise. The conflict was not over. Sloane's anger would fester and grow more dangerous. The world outside the town hall was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but for the first time in a very long time, Evelyn Moore did not feel alone. She was a strand in a rope, and she knew it would hold. Jeb Sloane's public defeat did not mellow him. It hardened him into something brittle and dangerous. Humiliation was a fire that burned hotter than any ambition. And Sloane's pride was a smoldering ruin. He abandoned all pretense of law and business. The Moore property was no longer a strategic asset for the railroad. It was an insult that had to be erased. If he could not have the land, he would ensure no one could. He would burn the house, the stable, the defiant little family, and the sheriff's victory to the ground. The night air was still and cool, a welcome relief after the heat of the day. A sliver of moon offered little light, leaving the alleys and yards of Red Butte in deep shadow. Inside the small house, Evelyn's mother slept, her breathing slow and even. Evelyn sat in a rocking chair in the parlor, the simple gold band on her finger a foreign and wonderful weight. She was engaged to be married to Sheriff Silas Reeve. The words were a quiet miracle, a truth so new and fragile she was almost afraid to touch it. But the fear that had been her constant companion for 2 years was gone, replaced by a deep, steady calm that felt like coming home. She did not know that Silas was not at home in his own bed. He was lying flat on his stomach on the low roof of the blacksmith's shed across the street, a rifle resting on the peak. He had known, with a grim certainty that settled in his gut like a cold stone, that Sloane would not let the matter rest. A public humiliation demanded a private and violent response. He had spent the day quietly gathering his resources. His deputy, a young, steady man named Ben, was concealed in the darkness of the livery stable. 2 trusted ranchers, men who owed Silas their loyalty and who despised Sloane's bullying tactics, were hidden in the rocky, narrow alley that ran alongside the Moore property. They were not lawmen, but they were good men with steady hands. And tonight, that was enough. They were waiting for a fire to be started. In a room at the town's only hotel, Annabelle was also awake. She had watched the scene in the town hall with a feeling of dizzying dislocation, as if the ground had given way beneath her. She had come back to Red Butte to secure her future, to win, and in a single, quiet moment, she had lost everything. She had lost Caleb, whose fawning respect had now turned to a cold, dismissive anger. She had lost the town's admiration, and she had lost her sister. Not to an argument or a rivalry, but to a genuine, unassailable love that made her own schemes look cheap and hollow. She heard voices in the hall outside her room, Caleb's low murmur, and the rougher tones of Thomas Miller, one of Sloane's men. The door to Caleb's room next door creaked open and shut. The words were muffled, but through the thin wall, she could make out the shape of the plan. Oil, the stable, a quick blaze, no witnesses. The words were a cold slap of reality. This was not a business transaction anymore. This was something dark and final. A part of her, the frightened, selfish part, wanted to stay in the room, to pull the covers over her head and pretend she had heard nothing. But the image of Evelyn's face in the town hall, not triumphant, but full of a quiet, forgiving strength, rose in her mind. And she thought of the house, the one she had called a wreck, and the sudden, fierce realization that it was the only real home she had ever known. For the first time, a fear greater than the fear of being poor took hold of her, the fear of what she was becoming. She slipped out of her room and followed them, a ghost in the shadows. 2 dark figures moved through the alley beside the Moore house. They moved quickly, carrying heavy cans. One of them, Miller, began to pour a dark, glistening line of lamp oil along the dry wooden wall of the stable. The other man, Caleb Hart, stood watch, a pistol in his hand. From the blacksmith's roof, Silas watched, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He waited. He needed to catch them in the act, an undeniable crime that would stick. Annabelle, hidden behind a rain barrel at the mouth of the alley, watched in horror. Miller finished his work and pulled a match from his pocket. The tiny scrape of phosphorus on stone was a shockingly loud sound in the night. The match flared, a tiny, malevolent star. In that instant, something inside Annabelle broke. She lunged forward, her silk dress tearing on a splintered fence post. She kicked at the can of oil, sending it clattering across the stones, and with a desperate sob, she scooped handfuls of dirt and gravel onto the dark, wet line on the ground. Trying to smother it, she screamed a single word, "Fire!" Miller, startled, dropped the match. It landed in a small puddle of spilled oil. A whoosh of sound and a hungry, orange flame leaped up the side of the stable wall. Caleb spun around, his face a mask of fury in the sudden light. He saw Annabelle. He shouted her name, a curse, and shoved her, hard. She stumbled backward, tripping over the scattered rocks, and fell to the ground. The breath knocked out of her. The first gunshot was not a loud boom, but a sharp, flat crack that echoed in the narrow alley. It came from the livery. A lantern near Caleb shattered, showering him with glass and darkness. Ben, the deputy, had fired. From the other end of the alley, the two ranchers opened fire. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness in strobing, chaotic bursts, the air filled with the sharp, sulphurous smell of gunpowder smoke. It was not a heroic battle. It was a terrifying, clumsy affair. One of Sloane's men screamed and fell, clutching his leg. A bullet splintered the wood of the fence inches from one of the ranchers' heads. The sound was deafening, the confusion absolute. As the first shots were fired, Evelyn had thrown open the front door. She saw the orange glow, saw the figure of her sister on the ground, and saw Caleb raising his pistol again, this time aiming at Annabelle. Evelyn did not hesitate. She ran, her only thought to get to her sister. She grabbed Annabelle's arm and dragged her, half conscious and gasping, back toward the relative safety of the porch just as a bullet from Silas's rifle on the roof struck the pistol from Caleb's hand, sending it spinning into the darkness. Caleb clutched his numbed, bleeding hand and, without a backward glance, fled into the night. Silas and his men closed in, and the fight was over as quickly as it had begun. Sloane, who had been watching from the street, was surrounded before he could even draw his weapon. His men, one wounded, threw down their guns. The small fire on the stable wall was quickly beaten out with horse blankets, leaving a blackened, smoky scar. The house was safe. In the aftermath, in the sudden, ringing silence broken only by the groans of the wounded man, Evelyn knelt beside her sister on the porch. Annabelle was shaking, not from the cold, but from a deep, internal shock. She looked at Evelyn, her eyes full of a terrible, bottomless shame. She began to speak, the words tumbling out in a torrent of confession. "I did not love him. Evelyn, I never loved Caleb. I was just so scared. I saw the way people looked at Mama, the way they pitied her after Papa died. I did not want that. I did not want to be poor and alone." She was sobbing now. Great, shuddering gasps. "I saw you, and you were always so calm. Nothing seemed to touch you. You had a strength I did not understand, and I hated it. I was jealous of it. So I took the one thing I thought mattered. I took him because it was easier than trying to be like you." The confession, raw and unvarnished, laid bare the wound that had festered between them for 2 years. It was not about love, or even passion. It was about fear. Evelyn looked at her sister, huddled and broken on the porch steps, and felt not the old sting of betrayal, but a deep, aching sorrow. She reached out and took Annabelle's hand. She said, "Your life is your own, Annabelle, but you have to stand on your own 2 feet now. You have to build it yourself. You cannot take the pieces of someone else's." It was forgiveness, but it was not absolution. It was a challenge, a path forward. Annabelle nodded, her tears a quiet stream now. "I will," she whispered. "I promise." She said she would leave Red Butte, that she could not stay. Thalia, who had come running at the sound of the shots, overheard and offered a solution. A friend of hers ran a dairy farm up north. It was hard work, but it was honest. Annabelle accepted without hesitation. Silas came and stood on the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand. His face was grim, but his eyes, when he looked at Evelyn, were full of a fierce pride. Justice had been served. Sloan and his men were being marched to the jail. Caleb would be found. The ordeal was over. The night was quiet again. Lydia, who had been woken by the commotion and had been hiding with a neighbor, came running across the street and launched herself into Evelyn's arms. She buried her face in Evelyn's neck, her small body trembling. She held on tight and whispered, her voice muffled but clear, "My mama, too, is now my mama." Evelyn held the child close, the simple gold band on her finger pressed against Lydia's back. The house behind her was still filled with the faint smell of smoke, a reminder of the danger that had passed. But it was standing, it was safe, and it was, finally, a home. The wedding was not a grand affair, but it was a true one. They were married in the small clapboard church on a bright, wind-swept afternoon. The pews were filled not with strangers or dignitaries, but with the weathered, familiar faces of Red Butte. The ranchers who had stood with Silas in the alley sat beside the women of the Mending the West Society. Thalia, her eyes shining, stood beside Evelyn as her witness, while Ben, the deputy, stood with Silas. Lydia, wearing a new blue dress with a yellow sash, acted as the flower girl, though instead of flowers, she clutched the precious drawing of her family, her face a study in solemn importance. The ceremony was short and simple, the preacher's words almost lost to the sound of the wind rattling the ill-fitting window frames. Evelyn wore a plain cream-colored dress she had sewn herself, and in her hair, she had woven a few late-blooming prairie wildflowers. Silas wore his dark Sunday suit, looking slightly uncomfortable but solid as an oak. When he placed the worn gold ring on her finger for the second time, his hand, calloused and strong, was gentle. His vows were spoken in the same low, steady voice he used for everything, but the promise in them was a bedrock on which she knew she could build a life. Afterward, there was no fancy reception, just a gathering in the churchyard. Talia had baked a mountain of cornbread, and someone had brought a fiddle. The music was lively and a little off-key, a perfect sound for a town that was itself a little rough around the edges. Evelyn watched Silas as he spoke with one of the ranchers, a rare, easy smile on his face. She watched Lydia chase a butterfly through the tall grass. She felt a sense of belonging so profound it was like a quiet, steady warmth in her chest. A few weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon when the work was done, Silas looked at Evelyn. He said he had an errand to run, and he would like it if she and Lydia would walk with him. He did not say where they were going, but she saw a flicker of gentle purpose in his eyes and agreed without question. They walked down the center of the main street, a family. Lydia skipped between them, holding both of their hands. People tipped their hats as they passed, a few women on the boardwalk, who once would have offered Evelyn looks of pity or scorn, now nodded and smiled. The whispers had died, replaced by a quiet, settled respect. Their destination, Evelyn realized with a jolt of surprise, was the Beartooth Saloon, the place of her deepest humiliation. She felt a momentary flicker of the old apprehension, but it vanished as Silas squeezed her hand. He was not taking her there to erase a bad memory, but to replace it with a new one. He pushed open the batwing doors. The saloon was quiet in the late afternoon, with only a few patrons nursing beers at the bar. The bartender, a burly man named Gus with a handlebar mustache, looked up as they entered. His expression, usually a mask of weary indifference, softened when he saw Lydia. He reached under the bar and brought out a small, neatly made wooden frame. Inside it, under a clean piece of glass, was Lydia's drawing, the picture of Papa, me, and the lady in yellow, with a sense of quiet ceremony. Gus hung the framed picture on a nail on the wall behind the bar, right next to a faded wanted poster and the saloon's only calendar. He looked at Silas and then at Evelyn. He said a place like this ought to have a picture of the sheriff's family. It was good for business. From a dark corner table, Evelyn saw Margaret Finch. She was sitting alone, nursing a glass of sherry. She saw the picture go up on the wall. She saw the way Gus tipped his head toward Evelyn in a gesture of respect. A flush crept up Margaret's neck. She took a hasty sip of her sherry and became intensely interested in the scuffed toes of her own shoes. She had been defeated, not by an argument or a confrontation, but by a simple, undeniable truth, now framed and hanging on a public wall for all to see. As they stepped back out into the harsh afternoon sun, the air felt different. The wind had dropped. The sky to the west was no longer a clear, hard blue, but a deep, bruised purple. A low rumble echoed across the plains. The air smelled of dust and something else, something green and alive. It was the smell of rain. The first drop was a dark, sudden spot on the back of Evelyn's hand. Then another and another. Within moments, a steady, determined rain was falling. It was not a violent storm, but a soft, soaking rain that hissed on the hot dust of the street. People came out onto their porches to watch, their faces turned up to the sky, smiling. The red dust that had coated everything, that had been the very taste and texture of their hardship, began to run in muddy rivulets, washing the world clean. The creek, which had been a dry, cracked wound in the earth, began to whisper and then to gurgle with a life it had not known for months. They ran the rest of the way home, laughing, their clothes soaked through. That night, Evelyn lay in bed, listening to the steady, soothing drum of the rain on the roof. It was the sound of peace, the sound of a long thirst being quenched. A letter arrived a week later, carried by the stagecoach on a road no longer choked with dust. The envelope was addressed in Annabelle's elegant, looping hand. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and read it aloud while Silas drank his morning coffee. Annabelle wrote that the work at the dairy farm was harder than anything she had ever known. Her hands were chapped, her back ached, and she smelled perpetually of sour milk. The wages were next to nothing. But, she wrote, for the first time in her life, she felt free. She was earning her own bread, beholden to no one. Her worth was not measured by the quality of her dress or the wealth of the man on her arm, but by the weight of the milk pails she carried each morning. She promised she would visit in the autumn, when the leaves turned, and she signed it with a sentence that made Evelyn's throat tighten. When I come, it will be me, not the shadow of anyone else. Evelyn folded the letter. The future of Red Butte was still uncertain. The railroad would continue its relentless march. There would be other droughts, other feuds, other lean years when cattle went missing and tempers ran hot. The frontier would never be a gentle place. But something fundamental had shifted. The town had been tested, and it had held. They would face the future's hardships not as a collection of isolated, fearful individuals, but as a community that had learned how to mend its own wounds. She looked out the window at the green, washed world. She thought of her journey, from the quiet, shamed woman in the general store to the wife of the sheriff, the mother of a little girl who was, at that very moment, happily making mud pies in the backyard. She looked down at the simple gold ring on her finger. She had not been rescued. She had not been saved. She had been met, halfway, by a good man who saw the strength that had been inside her all along. She had made a choice. In the saloon, in the storm, in the town hall. She had chosen to stop running. She had chosen to trust, to love, to fight. It was not because she was more deserving than anyone else, she thought to herself, a quiet, certain truth settling in her heart. It was because she had dared to choose. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And we invite you to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story in the video can be heard by more people.